Well, I appreciate that very much because I was wondering how to make the transition from Nicholas's very fine lecture on how economists look at economic growth. You may have noticed, I certainly did, that finance was never mentioned. Money was never mentioned. It just had nothing to do with what economists are really interested in when they think about long-term economic growth. So I welcome this opportunity to bring in finance, and I welcome actually David's invitation, and I especially welcomed this grouping of historians and archaeologists who are concerned about looking, as economic historians should look, at the ancient world and what was going on economically. So I'm looking forward very much to the rest of the conference and to the contributions of other participants here. I intend to stay through the entire conference, but I appreciate very much this opportunity. Let me pick up where Nicholas left off, ignoring finance, and talk about the development of financial systems. The basic argument in especially the most recent book on a concise history of international finance is that financial innovation, economic growth, they always go together. Now there's always an issue which precedes the other. And we specialists in financial history are convinced that we can see the elements for finance and financial innovations always arising before you see the kinds of productivity growth or the changes in technology that economic historians look at. So, in the short run, however, financial crises are the rule, and they get a lot of the attention. I agree, they should. It's important to respond correctly. But the theme overall is that the correct response requires coordination, and it's a complicated process because the financial system is a complicated system. It doesn't just consist of money. It doesn't just consist of capital markets. It doesn't just consist of banks. And it doesn't just consist of government regulators or government debt. So you have to coordinate these aspects. And one aspect is banking, which we think of as relationship finance. For economic historians, that's basically the modern version of personal exchange. But it also requires then looking at impersonal exchange, which basically comes from transparent finance through markets. And in the background, always has to be oversight by governments, which means third-party enforcement. This is the whole thing about property rights and the idea of institutional economics. What I'm going to argue today is sovereign debt is the key for coordination of those three elements, and it's important to develop a correct response to sovereign debt, to reinstate complementary coordination of these three elements in a financial system if you're going to make progress. And the argument is, what's so important about sovereign debt? And I once had this question posed to me, actually visiting friends. Okay, I'll identify, sort of. It was at Oxford University, and I'm having a very congenial lunch. And this other economic historian, whom I regarded as a friend, said, "Oh, Larry, what's the point of sovereign debt?" And I'm challenged. I don't know how to respond. This is a friend. This is, this is cutting at the basis of my research. And sometimes when you're under pressure, you fold, but sometimes you come through. And I think I came through because I said one word: collateral. And that is it turns out, the more I think about it, the more convinced I am that that's the key, collateral. Sovereign debt then, when it's accepted as collateral, all through the economy, helps to coordinate banks to credit markets and government oversight. Government oversight because the government wants to keep it trusted as collateral. So when it's not trusted, though, everything goes awry and you'll have your financial crises. The more interesting thing, as I look at it historically, is that when it's sequestered, which is the current situation, by the way, or siloed, which is kind of the way finance people like to mention it, everything slows down. And here in Europe, you're probably aware of that. We have the ongoing Eurozone crisis, and it's exemplary of the problem of sequestered sovereign debt. Greece, past and present, is even more of an example that is useful. And I always like to start on this typically with the current situation to try to orient people, and then we'll go back in time. So if we look at Eurobonds as collateral or not, I think this helps illustrate the point. There's something called the Eurozone, with the European Central Bank that's established at the beginning of the 21st century. And what they do is gradually bring more and more countries into this system to finally get it fully operational when euro notes and coins are actually going to be available. And you can see here, the very last country to come in is Greece. And I have this in another book, which David didn't put up, but you know, there are other books. So there are a couple of textbooks actually on the economics of the European Union, and this is one of my favorite graphs here. I like to keep updating to see how it's going. And the argument there was that the incentives to join the European monetary system were especially strong for countries that had the worst quality of sovereign debt. And the timing kind of goes along with this. Germany, of course, is the most reluctant to let anybody else in. And then other countries start coming in. The very last one to come in is Greece, but you can see they had the most incentive because they had to pay the highest interest rates of all on their sovereign debt before they joined the euro. And then things held together very nicely while the European Central Bank was willing, in fact, this is in the charter, to accept the sovereign bond of any member country on the same basis as the sovereign bond of any other country. Once you're in the European monetary system, then your government's sovereign debt is equally acceptable as collateral for loans from the European Central Bank. And during that period, you can see 10 years, everything worked beautifully for, it almost looked like there was a euro bond, right? But of course there isn't, because there is no central government for the European Union, so there can't really be a euro bond. And when the realization struck that, hey, they're not actually acting all the same, while they have this situation, things broke apart and we have the ongoing euro crisis. Well, I have a whole nother lecture on that. We're not going to go into that. The point is made that there's collateral damage. And when sovereign debt is accepted as collateral, things work well, and when it's not, they don't. Now, it turns out we have global financial markets arising after the end of the Bretton Woods system, which I date as 1973, and the end of capital controls, meaning capital going across national boundaries. I probably should say something about repo markets. This is a phrase that'll come up again and again, but the idea was that banks, to enter into competition in this new global financial market, had to have a new source of funding other than their own deposits, and what they found very convenient were sovereign bonds, which then could be used as collateral to borrow in the capital markets on the condition that they would buy back the sovereign bond at a future date when the loan had expired. So repo means you would take repossession of this asset that you put as collateral for a short-term loan, okay? So when banks start to enter into this, it becomes a very interesting system. If you look at the structure of bank assets, it turns out that, of liabilities, excuse me, that the liabilities increasingly are going to be less deposits and more these kinds of borrowings on the basis of repo markets. What's going to be acceptable as collateral then to enter into this repo market? It'll be sovereign bonds. And so that's what was showing up and actually leads to the establishment of the European monetary system. But in the background, with the collapse of the Soviet Union and of essentially planned economies, the United States Treasury bonds and bills, US sovereign debt, became extremely important. The rise of China, for example, has disrupted global markets. Everybody knows that. It's obvious in the trade and so on. But maybe what is not so evident is one of the reasons they've disrupted global markets is the huge buildup of foreign reserves, which has been mostly in the form of US Treasury of sovereign debt. And what has that done? Sequestered sovereign debt in a major way out of these global financial markets. That has created a problem that finance people are very much aware of. Doesn't really hit, I just want to make you aware of it, so you're now among the privileged few who are aware that this is a problem. Just to show that, there had been changing collateral space. Previous administration under the Clintons managed to reduce the total of privately held sovereign debt. It's made up by a rise in the U.S. Foreign debt that's held, sovereign debt that's held foreign and international. That's in the red line. I think that shows up, yeah. So that shows up going on, and then that is sequestering, basically, the use of U.S. sovereign bonds as collateral in global financial markets. That creates a problem. Comes to the rescue, residential mortgage-backed bonds, and you can see this explosion of U.S. financial creativity, which ends in, as we all know, disaster. It's now actually recovering a bit, oh God, at those high levels. That's a problem. We also saw in the previous graph that U.S. debt has, in response, really increased, but it hasn't really increased in the private sphere. So what happens is an excess supply of government debt now coming in, and what we're seeing now is negative yields on larger and larger proportions of sovereign debt being issued by more and more countries. And this is all in the most recent publication of the International Monetary Fund. Only the US and the UK are staying out of negative territory, but I can tell you from my own pension fund, it's not high enough to really keep us going. In fact, there is this changing collateral space so that we have a problem. The central bank reactions have reduced the supply of sovereign bonds in private markets, as well as the supply of commercial paper or mortgage-backed securities. The fiscal austerity by European governments hasn't helped. Financial regulations haven't helped. They've reduced bank access to the repo markets via the traditional collateral. So far, we haven't come up with a solution. So leveraging is prolonged. Getting out of this overhang of debt is long, and economic recovery continues to be sluggish. So financial innovation, I would argue, is needed, and how to do it this time around, I have some ideas. I'm not going to share those, but I do think going back into history shows how these kinds of crises were overcome repeatedly, and so may give us some clue how to proceed in the present. So for this, for now to having set the tone with the current situation, to go back into history, let's see where there were defining moments in our history. Most financial histories focus on financial crises, and you're going to see more and more of those. You've already seen a lot of them. But my argument is modern finance arose with the creation of collateral assets, typically sovereign bonds, and so they should be our focus. Sovereign debt became the dominant asset for the success of modern international finance, and so the questions become when, how, and why. So that's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to just give you a brief here before I focus where I really think the critical defining moments occurred. The rise of collateral in history. I'll learn more about this from the presentations in the rest of the conference for the next few days. I'm going to say they were basically trade goods that could be metals, which are easily identifiable. They have to be identifiable, readily recognizable trade goods. They can't be, exotic things to be useful as collateral. Coins become very, very important because they're easily identified as what they are and can be identified as collateral. Later, standard legal documents, bills of exchange. Those are going to be turned into securitization, which arises with bills of lading on identifying what's on a ship or what's located in a warehouse, just sitting there. It could be collateral, but it has to be identified as such, and so you need a standard warrant that would identify that as collateral. Public debt, that's really the breakthrough, and it becomes in stages with first life annuities and then perpetual annuities. Building on that, to expand the scope of public debt, we then will get a rise of what could be called blue chips at the time. VOC would be the Dutch East India Company, its bonds, East India Company in England, and the Bank of England. There's a strategic complementarity in these, that you will get public finance requires the issuance of finance basically to fight wars, is the typical thing. But then that establishes credits, which can be used in the real economy for trade and industry. Eventually, you get a development then of financial systems, which means banks, markets, capital markets, and taxes, a regular flow of taxes. And out of that comes, it seems like magic, typically economic growth. And that economic growth is often a combination of what Nicholas was calling extensive growth, with growth of population typically, and intensive growth, a growth of per capita income. Those incidents occur repeatedly in history, and actually in the introduction to the Cambridge History of Capitalism, I refer to those as Malthusian singularities. Malthusian singularities. Those are occasions when you get, oh my God, both an increase in population and an increase in per capita income, both extensive and intensive growth. So those go together, and my own hobby horse on this to try to convince people is that what really helps sustain the strategic complementarity are secondary markets for funded debt and the liquidity of those. But we'll see, I'm going to give you an example I think that will resonate later on. How did this start? Well, everybody who does financial history will agree that modern finance started with the Italians. But it depends which Italian author you look at or read first. Is it Florence? That's the usual case. Is it Venice? Well, my friend Luciano Pezzolo says, yeah, it's Venice. Is it Genoa? Giuseppe Folone will insist it's Genoa. So I don't know quite how to put all this together. I want to be friends with everybody. So I just argue it's the Papal States. And it starts with the Pope. So it's Pope Urban IV. He's in the middle of the 13th century. He basically finances Charles of Anjou against the German emperor based in Sicily. But he makes a deal. I will support you if you allow me to collect taxes from the parishes in France. So he's got a revenue source that's continuous. It's in France, it's not in the Papal States. And then he uses the Florence bankers in Florence to service the long-term debt that's helping to finance it. So here's the basic argument. The Italian city-states all arise in response to the Papal Revolution, which is 1077. And they all mimic the institutional innovations of the Roman papacy, which is to set up canon law, how to enforce it, think of yourself as a corporation with perpetual life, and that's what the city-states are doing. They form in the Lombardy League, and so on. But then, to help create the financing of it, the papal finance internationally develops the Foreign Bill of Exchange and the corporate form of banks that arise to facilitate papal finance. Then the sovereign debt is created individually by these Italian and Catalonian city-states, Florence, Genoa, Papal States, Venice, and Barcelona, and so on. Then I discovered the most successful in the long run of these turns out to be Milan. They specify that commercial debts by the merchants of Milan have to be collateralized by the city bonds. And they are the city-state that recovers best from the Black Death. And we'll see some evidence of this in just a bit. The Genoese bring things together in a very nice way that combine short-term government debt, the asientos, with long-term debt, the euros, as collateral. And that's a very important innovation in response to war finance of Charles V and Philip II. So here's some nice figures to put some context into this. First, Luciano has recreated these comparisons of interest rates, showing that Italy leads. Of course, you'll see Venice as a leader in this, although even Luciano has to admit that Genoa ends up having lower interest rates by the time you get into the 15th century. Eventually, Holland catches up, and you can see a general pattern there, starting actually around the middle of the 15th century with recovery from the Black Death. And all these states have created sovereign debt, it's still outstanding, it's still there, and the interest rates on them fall. And they retain very low levels, typically below 5% for centuries. I had another graph in here. Let me see. The missing graph shows it wasn't just Italy, but also Catalonia. So there are city-states in Catalonia during that same time period that also have very high interest rates, around 12%, in response to the Black Death, and then following the Black Death. And with recovery, they all fall down below 5%. So this is a general phenomenon. So city-states create sovereign debt. They create a serious permanent drop in the rate of interest. And I know David has this whole argument that really generates then the creation of modern economic growth. But there are problems with these city-states. The sovereign debt is typically very closely held by their own citizens. So there's not a big market, really, for that sovereign debt. The interest payments typically vary with the variance in tax receipts. So there's a question of, are tax receipts going to be regular and constant? Also, very often the origin of the sovereign debt is a forced loan. Hey, you rich guys here, we're under threat, pony up and give us some money so that we can buy off the mercenary army or whatever is required. And that creates incentives for redemption or repudiation if the city feels, forget it, it didn't work. A longer term problem is that in those Italian city-states and in Catalonia, you have charities or religious institutions. They typically sequester these long-term debts because that turns out to be a very good long-run source of revenue to sustain charitable operations. You might say the same thing happens with trusts in the Islamic world as well. Another problem is excise taxes, which have to be generated to service these long-term debts, are typically on consumer goods with inelastic demand, so that it's very difficult to increase the service or to pay off these sovereign debts. Islam has an especially difficult problem on this because they reject alcohol and tobacco, so those are the two goods that when the Brits learn how to put excise taxes on those sin goods, they get continued increases in tax revenues, which are very beneficial for servicing their long-term debt. The final problem, of course, with city-state sovereign debt is you've got to maintain military independence, and that becomes, with the military revolutions that follow, increasingly difficult with the British national debt. Another one of my favorite graphs. Starts in 1694 with the establishment of the Bank of England. And that's the financial completion of the Glorious Revolution starting in 1688, 1689. Not too much happens there. You see there's a war and it increases. It doesn't decrease after the War of the Spanish Succession. The market value does decrease. There's something called the South Sea Bubble, which collapses the market value. But the interesting thing is the total nominal size of the debt stays the same. Gradually it's paid off very slightly, and you can see the market value rises in response. So there's a critical period there for validating the new forms of sovereign debt as collateral. The interesting thing is it doesn't really get paid off because what happens is that it continues to be serviced because excise taxes rise. Britain has won that war. They win the succeeding wars. They get an increase in trade possibilities. You can see customs revenues rising. More importantly, inside Britain, the excise taxes increase, and they continue to increase. And they increase actually even faster than income increases because these are excise taxes on sugar, on tobacco, on coffee, on so-called sin goods. So the point here is that we finally found a way to keep sovereign debt out there. And the interest is basically 3%. When the market value rises to the nominal value, it's typically going to be 3 or a little bit more than 3%. And then we see in succeeding wars, the national debt increases, but after the war, it doesn't get paid off. The only thing that happens is the market value comes up again. Until we get the very final period, which, as an American, I'm very proud of this, the War of American Independence. Things kind of get split apart. The market value of the debt goes down. The total nominal debt continues to be up there. And then when the French wars open up, it really explodes at the end of the graph, and you'll see an increasing divergence there from the market value. So this is what a contemporary observer called the rising ocean of annuities, of the 3% consols, which come in the middle of that period after the break in 1748. So this is sovereign debt that just keeps getting marketed, it keeps getting serviced, and since it's used to finance wars, the wars are typically successful. That increases the tax revenues that can come in from customs revenues and from excise taxes. Things are good. So what I'm trying to establish there is a concept in basic economics. You talk about the wheel of wealth and the circular flow of income. What goes around comes around, and what I'm arguing here is that the interest payments on sovereign debt go around, okay. Usually when economists look at this, say, yeah, they go to the rich people who are holding the debt, but the spending by the government then helps to increase then the access to foreign trade and the development of internal trade. When it does that, then the tax flow that's coming into the government, okay, it's mostly tax on the poorer people, the working class, so there is this redistribution, but if we set aside the class distribution, just think of the government, then we've got a circular flow there and a complementarity of both the tax revenues and the marketability of the sovereign debt. And the sovereign debt, when it's outstanding, is used as collateral to help finance the expansion of trade. And the expansion of trade generates more excise revenues, and you get the sum. So there's a symbiosis there, and that's leads me to the next thing, which really is interesting, is the symbiosis of the Dutch, who have preceded, kind of taught the Brits the value of doing these things. And a contemporary observer says, you know, these annuities are great because there are ways you can use it. One way, you just pay the money, the market value of it. You have the full amount of your purchase inscribed in the books maintained by the Bank of England. Or you could delay payment and say, you know, I've got information. My friends tell me the price is going to rise because the war is over. And when the war is over, the price is going to rise. So let me just prolong the settlement just a little bit, okay? And so for another 3 or 4 months. Or you can say, hey, I can sell the contract to another individual and then just pocket the difference in price if, as I was informed by my friends in England, the price of the console had risen in the meantime. So you can speculate on this strictly. That's all fun, but what's really interesting, and this is where another concept comes in, leverage. When you get this financial innovation, there is a possibility of leverage. And here's an identification in 1776 that the Dutch are fully aware of the concept our finance experts now call leverage. You can pledge the 1,000 pounds of console you have committed to purchase, but you haven't paid out the money, as collateral. And I highlighted that. It's not in the original, but I just, you know, collateral. You know, I had this inspiration. Here it shows up again. For a loan of cash to be used for another venture to finance the expansion of trade. So this is what we call leveraging. Or more sophisticated language, we could call it rehypothecation. So that's the, I think it's immoral, but actually this sort of thing was illegal in France, and it just turned out that it was legal with the English annuities and in the case. Now, what I just want to show, there was a crisis. The crisis turns out at the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763. I'm just showing you here some exchange rates between Amsterdam and London, and between Paris and London, leading up, you know, through the year of 1763. You may recall that France lost that. Britain won. The Dutch are basically neutral. But right there, when there's a big gap opens up, doesn't look like much on the initial graph, but it's a financial crisis, a very serious financial crisis in Amsterdam, and it shows up with an extreme increase in short-term interest rates in Amsterdam. That's shown by the gap between those two different exchange rates. One's a spot exchange rate, the other's a forward exchange rate. Nothing really happens in Paris. That's kind of excluded. They're feeling pretty confident. But of course, their exchange rate is falling. Now, what happens in response to this crisis is a very interesting set of reactions in the Bank of Amsterdam. They're supposed to be just strictly a cash-only operation. But in fact, in response to this crisis, they carry out a set of what we would call now repo operations. And the repo operations are shown up here. Let's see if I can get my, yeah, here we go. So this will show up. There's a set of transfers that are going by the Bank of Amsterdam to a set of the richest merchant bankers who have the largest accounts in the Bank of Amsterdam. And they are setting up transfers as those individuals deposit increasing amounts of silver coins, which are, they have said, here's our collateral, we loan it to you to give us this credit in our account here, but we will buy back those coins when we can, when the crisis is over, when we've completed taking care of our existing contracts. And sure enough, at that stage, by golly, they do. And what happens, the transfers are paid off, the repo operation is closed out, the coins that they have to their credit in their accounts rise, and actually they begin to increase bullion because the crisis has gone on long enough. The Bank of Amsterdam is now willing to accept bullion as well as coins. This is a forthcoming article in a major finance journal to show, yeah, the Bank of Amsterdam was doing repo operations in the 18th century, and it worked. Question, where did these rich people get these coins to pledge as collateral? Because you'd think, well, shoot, you know, typically they would have them on account in the Spesiekamer at the Bank of Amsterdam, or they'd just have them in the home office. But it turns out my same source that was telling me how collateral was so important and leveraging was possible with annuities, I'm sorry, it's in French, but I didn't want to insult you by giving you my translation of this, but I think you can see. He's saying, yeah, 1763, there was a huge problem on the Amsterdam Exchange. And the richest negotiants, richest merchants, the same ones that are identified in that previous graph, just didn't have any way to meet their obligations. What they did was they sold their funds in England to take advantage of this. And this was the quickest way and the easiest way to bring in very large sums of specie. And because when they sold off their annuities, they got then the gold or silver from England. And it's huge amounts of these annuities are held by the Dutch on a regular basis. So I just thought, out of curiosity, I'd take a look at this graph on the shocks of 1763 and 1772 on the prices. And you can see, yeah, when in 1763, the earlier part of the graph, there's that shock with the war. It looks like they're going to lose, and then they get the news, oh my God, we've won everywhere. So all those securities go up. The bottom one are the consols, which is the basic form of the sovereign debt. And then it drops, but very slightly, as the Dutch are selling off their annuities in order to get the silver. And then it recovers as the crisis is over. And you can see that the level of the share price, and remember there's a constant 3% on these consols as the interest rate. So the yield is also staying quite constant. And what that means is that the value of consols as collateral for trade throughout Europe, in fact, because the consols are held by the Swiss, by the Dutch, by Germans, everywhere. So it's a general expansion of trade there. Okay, so I just had to throw that in. That, of course, the hero in the background for the success of the English in the 7 Years' War is this guy who's feted in the chapel of the Guildhall in London. That's William Pitt the Elder. And you can see the Brits understood, the merchants in the city of London understood the importance of Pitt actually winning the 7 Years' War and setting it up. And so this elaborate statuary. I was stunned. I mean, come on. But it's amazing. So let's look at his system. He expands in response to the war the Bank of England, increases the size of their charter. They service most of the sovereign debt. They take over that whole business of the sovereign debt, including managing the accounts of the 3% consuls. And they provide foreign exchange to the continental allies. He's allowing the rise of country banking. Especially important is the country banking in Scotland, which is already unified with Britain. He issues new debt, but it's always the 3% consuls. And he's placing many of those initially in Amsterdam because it's so useful in Amsterdam. He raises excise taxes to service that expanded debt, but trade is rising, so he's getting increased customs revenues. Now, it turns out he has diverse war finance strategies for North America, for Europe, and for India. So it's a huge thing, you know, where he's got all of these battles going on. He wins everywhere, but it turns out the strategy, the financial strategy, is quite different. Only really in Europe is this strategy that I've described in The Rise of Financial Capitalism really operative. So the question is, which works? And the answer comes out in the US. And it's Alexander Hamilton. I can't resist, I gotta put this in, so. I have to admit, I did see the musical. I'm still tearing up, so I recommend it highly. It's great entertainment. It's a great history lesson, especially because you realize Alexander Hamilton really was the founding father of the American economy. And Jefferson, oh, gee. Anyway, and just to prove that my adulation of Hamilton precedes it, actually, when I had a retirement, I had my son-in-law, who's a graphics artist, see how closely he could make me, I'm on the right, look like Alexander Hamilton. I think the resemblance is stunning, okay? I hope you do too. Okay, enough of that. What was Hamilton's system? Basically, he's imitating William Pitt the Elder. He's setting up a US mint. He has a bimetallic standard for a uniform national currency, replacing what had been used, the Spanish pilar. He sets up the Bank of the United States, a central bank modeled on the Bank of England, except it's even better because it has branches throughout each of the 13 states. The Bank of England at that time had no branches, didn't have branches until after 1825, actually after 1830. Like the Bank of England, it's fractional reserve. You think fractional reserve, I think leverage, okay? Because you can have outstanding liabilities that are multiple of your basic reserves in fully owned specie. He also has the same thing as the Bank of England, a monopoly of government payments. More importantly, and this is a European lesson that hasn't been learned, he consolidates the individual state debts into a federal debt. So back to my original graph there on the Euro thing, if there had been an Alexander Hamilton setting up the European Central Bank, certainly would have wanted to consolidate those sovereign debts of the individual member states into one European Union debt. Didn't happen. More importantly, I think, he establishes federal control of the customs revenues. There's a bit of luck because the US becomes a neutral as war breaks out in Europe, and customs revenues just skyrocket. So the servicing of this federal debt becomes nothing to deal with. At that same time, there's another Pitt. This is William Pitt the Younger. This is also an elaborate statue, also in the Guildhall of the City of London, facing his father across the way. And you have to go there to decide which one is more elaborate and which one to think. But both are just given enormous credit for having established the British Empire and the like. I think the important thing was the finance. William Pitt the Younger protects the Bank of England by suspending the convertibility of the pound sterling, and it continues to suspend it through quite a long period, 20 years plus, 1797, February 1797 till the end of 1819. He issues new debt on a large scale. You saw that in the earlier graph where the new consols are just skyrocketing. They're mainly 3% consols, at least to the formal London Stock Exchange established in 1801. So we get that. He encourages flight capital to come in. That was the basis of my Rise of Financial Capitalism book in 1990, the flight capital coming in from revolutionary Europe as revolutionary troops and Napoleon's troops go across Europe. Eventually, there's also flight capital after the war coming in from Latin America. He raises all taxes to service expanded debt, and Patrick O'Brien has hammered that story in again and again. He also, though, increases the income tax and to service the expanded debt. So the idea of complementarity then, as the proceeds of his new debt are spent inside the United Kingdom, the income of people rises and he taxes that, so it gets a circular flow, in addition to the flow that's coming from expansion of domestic trade and foreign trade. However, it's not met with total approbation at the time. So at the time, contemporaries, this is a James Gilroy cartoon showing Pitt has taken over the Bank of England, and inside his belly, secured by this huge lock, he has all the gold coin. So he's maintaining that away from the Bank of England. And then he's spewing out through his mouth paper currency, and actually, if you look closely below, there's more paper currency coming out for the common people and stuff. So this is not greeted with approbation at all at the time. So it's tough making these financial innovations and getting them secured. Across the way, of course, the reason he's doing this is to confront this guy, Napoleon I. And I picked this image because this is the beginning when he's the first consul. And the first consul is establishing law and the bureaucracy. So he's got him posed there, looking at the accounts with his right hand. His left hand is inside the coat there, but you just assume that he's going to pull it out with a quill and write down some figures, So he's totally an accountant. And the point I'm making here is he does set up a financial system that mimics, as he sees it, Pitt's system, William Pitt the Elder's system. He's maintaining convertibility in gold and silver of the French franc, so that's in response to the devaluation or the suspension of convertibility in Britain. He creates the Bank of France, very much on the model of the Bank of England, no branches, has a monopoly on the debt. He has what he thought at the time, and actually Hamilton thought this was important too, a sinking fund called the Caisse d'Amortissement, 1803. That's to establish confidence in the new French debt. He restores the capital market, the Bourse de Paris. In fact, sets up the financing of a fantastic building to isn't completed during his reign, but and now is no longer used because everything's gone electronic. But you know, he understands you've got to have this stock exchange, and it, you know, has to deal with this new debt and so on. But he misses the idea of complementarity of the debt, of the taxes. He actually reduces taxes in France to you know, sustain his credibility and his legitimacy eventually as the emperor, and instead just raises regular tribute from the satellite kingdoms, which means he has to keep exploiting satellite kingdoms and getting more and more satellites, which ends up, as we all know, with the fatal venture into Russia. In the meantime, and I'm just going to come very quickly to an end on this to show that this is the key moment here, but what happens is Napoleon keeps fighting off with his continental blockade. There's more description of the background details in the book, so I'm trying to encourage you actually to buy the book and see how this all works out. Because there is a guy, a financier in France, who understands exactly how this system works, and my argument is, had Napoleon actually paid attention to him, he probably would have, you know, established a French empire, because he would have mobilized the finance that was available in Holland and in the Spanish Empire effectively. But instead, he just puts Gabriel Ouvard in prison. And so I have a storyline there where every time Napoleon tries to get out of the trap he's put in for himself, Ouvard goes into prison again. But always, since he's in a trap, Ouvard has to come out of prison to try to help finance him out of it, and so it goes. But this just shows that there's more to this system than simply setting up those formal institutions that look right. And we're working well for Hamilton in the US, we're working well for Britain in the UK, but the similar kinds of imitations just, they didn't have that final thing, the complementarity of the taxes. Okay, so we have London responding. What happens is that Wellington, then his campaign is directly financed. They can't rely on allies anymore. And what happens is the capital goods industries expand in Britain. I spell out that story on the rise of financial capitalism. Meanwhile, Nathan Rothschild is helping the Bank of England finance the Allied forces. There's an expansion of trade. British merchants eventually are allowed to compete with the Americans both in the Caribbean and in India. That helps to keep expanding the tax base for customs revenues and excise taxes. Hamilton's system is working beautifully. What happens? Some guy named Jefferson comes in and tries to destroy it, and basically furthers more conflicts with westward expansion. He puts on an embargo on trade, cutting off customs revenues, undercutting then the servicing of the federal debt. He has to make up land sales. He enters into military conflict after destroying the first bank. His successor, Madison, closes down the first bank in 1810. Eventually, after the war, which barely won, the second bank of the United States is chartered. But even it closes in 1836 under Jackson. Crisis follows continued problems. But it seems that the impetus that Hamilton had initiated with economic growth and expansion and the financing with the complementarity of capital markets, of widespread banks, branch banking, and the federal servicing of federal debt with with customs revenues works. So eventually, the three revolutions, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and of course, the British Industrial Revolution coalesce over the next 50 years. And let's just give you that brief thing. Ending with France combining all this, trying to figure out how are those guys making it work. The story is sovereign bonds serve well as collateral. When they're serviced continuously, they're priced transparently. They're always subject to political pressures. And so the role of government is very important here. Alternative forms of collateral are difficult to establish or sustain. We have many examples. We're going to find out, I think, about Greek owls in the Dealing League. I'm looking forward to discussing that with Alain Bresson later. And of course, the Eurozone experience is fascinating material. And all of this gets back to how I started with the development of financial systems. Financial innovations, economic growth, they go together in the long run. But in the short run, these financial crises are the rule, and you get setbacks and reversals repeatedly. You have to respond correctly. It's very hard, even if you have examples of success to follow. And I'm afraid to say reversals keep recurring as well. Anyway, it's all there in a concise history of international finance, so I hope. If you're dissatisfied with any elements of the argument, please read the book and then send me your comments, and any errors you find would be greatly appreciated. Thank you.